We're going to give it we're going to give it just a couple more minutes as people trickle in. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Virginia Federation of Humane Societies educational series. I'm Risa Courier, and I'm a board member with the Federation and also the Director of Animal Services in Fairfax County. Thank you for all of those who joined us today. I know several of you are joining us for CE credit, so please, to ensure that you do get credit, make sure you put your name in the chat so we have that and we can send you the follow-up documentation. We are very excited to be joined today by Dr. Carolynn Bissett. She is the program manager for the Office of Veterinary Services, the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And in addition to being a wealth of knowledge on many different things relating to our work in animal welfare, Dr. Bissett is also very accessible. So I encourage you to learn from her, but also consider her a great resource for you and your questions as you do your work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bissett and her excellent presentation we're going to have today.
Hi, Risa, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shelter inspections, and then we're going to talk a little bit about avian flu. But I'll leave up the starter slide here for you guys to definitely get my contact information if you don't already have it. I've been around a while now, so hopefully everybody has it by now, but email is great. I always have that with me. The multitude of phone numbers there. The first two are my office phones. The last one, that 937, is my cell phone. And so you're more than welcome to call or text me on that. If I don't answer right away, I will get back to you. I always have that with me. So even on the weekends, if you have seizure questions, if you're an ACO, or just other questions about anything, you can certainly give me a call or a text and I will get back to you. So we'll go ahead and get started. Is that advancing okay? Slides?
It is, Dr. Bissett.
Okay, great, thank you. So I thought we'd start with just to kind of give you a reference point as to where we land in the grand scheme of things. So I do work for the state veterinarian, Dr. Charlie Broadus. Under him at VDACS, the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, we've got a number of different roles and responsibilities, everything from inspection of foods in the dairy and foods program and the meat and poultry services program to our 4 animal health laboratories, which some of you may utilize for various testing, necropsy, our lab up in Warrington. Dr. Wiseman up there does a lot of forensic cruelty necropsies for animal control agencies, both in Virginia and in Maryland as well. And then we also have the hemp enforcement program, which is a relatively new program and sort of doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be under a veterinarian's scope. I mean, it is enforcement of the hemp laws and CBD and THC levels and things like that in edibles, but it started off in the dairy and foods program and has become its own program. And then last but not least is this Office of Veterinary Services, which is the program that I run. And we have sort of 3 main roles within the Office of Veterinary Services, and that's livestock and poultry animal health, animal care or animal welfare is sort of more largely termed, and then emergency management. And so in the livestock and poultry animal health, we oversee everything from livestock markets, at foreign animal diseases. So that's why we'll talk about avian influenza at the end. There's other diseases that we don't have in the US that would impact livestock and poultry that we don't want in the US, but there it is overseas or in the Caribbean or nearby countries. And so we're actively working to try to keep that at bay. But we're here today, at least for the first half, to talk about our animal care program, which is a program of 5 people. So I always call us the Mighty Five, trying to keep down everything that goes on in the animal welfare scope of things at the state level. So I'm the manager there, and then Dr. Lane Songer is our supervising veterinarian. And you may run into her at different trainings. She does a lot of training. She does our euthanasia training program for the state, and does a lot of training at basic academies and in service, and just did a training last week on equine seizures for an in-service program. So you may encounter her. And then, of course, our 2 inspectors, if you're running a shelter, you're going to be familiar with them, Sherry and Christy. And they're out there doing inspections of animal shelters and now puppy shops, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then we have an administrative coordinator. That is position is currently vacant. We're hoping to be hiring for that again in the next couple of months. So until then, we're trying to keep up the Mighty Four, is trying to keep up the role of the Mighty Five. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how the program is based. And then, of course, I mentioned emergency management. We deal with hurricane response, and what may be of particular interest to this group is we do emergency pet sheltering at the state level. So if we had a large scale hurricane like a Katrina or something, Superstorm Sandy, or something that large and devastating, where we had to open up state human shelters, my program and staff would open up the associated pet shelters at the state level, so that those people that are evacuating to the human shelter, their pets have somewhere to go. Because as we well know, people are not likely to evacuate if they have pets in the home and they can't take them with them. So we serve that role as well. Here again, just the people that are involved in the animal care staff. And then some of the things that I mentioned already. So for shelters, really our animal care responsibilities, we kind of divide up into those dealing with animal shelters and those dealing directly with animal control officers, although we all know they're very intertwined. But with the animal shelters, we manage the animal custody record online reporting system, which is everyone's favorite January and February activity, to get your numbers for the previous year into that database so that it can be open to the public to look at those. And of course, we do animal shelter inspections, and we handle a lot of animal shelter complaints. And we do a lot of education and training. We're focusing a lot on that, especially with Dr. Songer on board, who is an excellent trainer. And so we're doing a lot more training and education than we've ever done before, which I think is really good to do that outreach. With animal control officers, we manage, or we house, I'll put it that way, the dangerous dog registry. It's actually local animal control officers that manage the registry, that input the data into that. But I think everyone in this group is probably familiar with that dangerous dog section of law, where dogs that are declared dangerous by a court of law must be put onto the registry and maintained there. And VDACS houses that registry and invoices localities for a portion of their registration fees. And that's what maintains that registry, the costs of housing that registry. Again, we do a lot of training. We are tasked in law with overseeing continuing education for animal control officers. And so every year we just finish this up, and thank you to all of you that are animal control officers that got your reports in on time. But we just finished up our annual status report, where we ask you for your continuing education that you attended in the past year. That goes into a monster spreadsheet because we're tasked in law with managing that continuing education. We've got about 450-ish, give or take, animal control officers in the state at any one time. Each one of those is required to do 15 hours of continuing education every 3 years, and we're the one tasked with tracking that. So there's a monster spreadsheet that my staff actually sits and inputs. Carrie Bissett, ACO for whatever county, did 8 hours of training this year, and puts in that training into this monster spreadsheet. I always say it would be my lottery dream if I won. Granted, I have to win quite a bit of money because it's not just my only lottery dream, but it is one of my lottery dreams to be able to build a database that ACOs would just be able to go in and track their continuing education there. But unfortunately, there's no money for that in the General Assembly budget. So we continue on with our monster spreadsheet. And then, of course, we serve as a technical resource to animal control officers for things like seizures. We can't really interpret code too much because we're not lawyers. We're all veterinary staff. Dr. Songer and I are both veterinarians, and then our inspectors are licensed veterinary technicians. But we can at least point you to the right spot in the code or regulation where things can be found. I'll just talk about pet shops just really briefly. In 2020, a law was passed that had VDACS inspecting pet shops that sell dogs and cats. And so it also asked us to develop regulations, and regulations take a number of years to develop. So that took about 4 years. They were completed in 2024, and we started inspections in 2024. We registered, this is a little outdated. We registered 18 pet shops. A couple have closed, one has opened. And so I think our status right now, as of this week, as of today, is 16 pet shops in the Commonwealth that sell dogs or cats. So we don't inspect those that sell other animals, like your rabbits, ferrets, guinea pigs, just those that sell dogs and cats. If you think that you've got one in your locality that you want to see if it is on our radar to be registered and inspected, by all means, reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly, or you can reach out to the general email account, which is animalcare@vdacs.virginia.gov. And we certainly have worked with ACOs in the past on pet shops in their locality. So let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is animal shelters. So this map is a little dated, but it's mostly accurate. This is the map of all of the animal shelters in Virginia. I need to get it updated, but the red little dogs there are what we call our contracted facilities. Those are private shelters that have a contract with the locality to act as their public shelter. The blue are the public animal shelters, and the green are the private animal shelters. And so public, of course, everybody knows those are the governmental run shelters. Private are non-governmental shelters, and then are contracted. And then the inspections that we do both unannounced routine inspections and complaint investigation inspections. A lot of times that's at the same time. They may not be separate. We don't have a separate process for a routine inspection versus a complaint inspection. An inspection is an inspection. It's just the routine ones we do routinely. Makes sense. It's kind of common sense there. But I will say that we used to do, when I first started 13 years ago, we did inspections of every facility every year. That's changed over the past 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, where we now do risk-based inspections. So if you don't have violations over a year or two, you may not see us for 12, 18, even up to 24 months, just depending on our schedule. But we wanted to focus more on those shelters that were having repeat violations, critical violations, or that just needed a little extra help. And so we may see those facilities every 2 to 6 months. So it just varies a great deal. What are we inspecting for? So these laws and regulations are really what we're inspecting for when we do shelter inspections. So in person, I would ask you guys what these code sections actually stand for, but we can't do that really in a virtual environment. But 6503 is the adequate care code. All shelters must provide adequate care, whether you're public or private. Also, rescues must provide adequate care. 6546 is the public animal shelter code section. 6548 is the private animal shelter code section, which references back to 6546. And so private animal shelters have to really follow both of those code sections. 6557 is the record keeping code section. So everybody should be familiar with that. That's what requires you to keep those animal custody records and submit that annually to the animal custody record online reporting system. And then 6574 and 6575, that should say 6575 there at the end, are the sterilization code sections that require shelters to sterilize animals within a certain time period, obviously to cut down on overpopulation. And then for regulations, we have our public and private animal shelter regulations, and those are the ones that we'll talk a little bit more about in detail, because those are where we see most of our violations or citations is in that regulation. And that's the one that really requires sanitation, separation of species for temperament, etc. The protocols that most people are familiar with, things like that. 115, if you're a private animal shelter, then you should be familiar with regulation chapter 115, which is the regulations for determining whether a facility meets the purpose of finding permanent adoptive homes for animals. And that is for private animal shelters. And then chapter 150 is the transportation. Is particularly important for animal control officers that have trucks that are transporting animals in the conduct of professional duty. So what else are we looking for? Generally, animal health is the big one, right? Where especially when we're doing complaints, we get a lot of complaints about inadequate animal care. And so we're looking for animal health. We're looking for disease control measures. Obviously, none of us wants to have an outbreak in a shelter. And so we are looking for those control measures to prevent that. Confinement and disposition, and that's all in code. So how are the animals confined and what happens to them? Record keeping. In regulation, it goes into detail about how to prevent animals from injury and disease, and veterinary oversight when applicable, and transportation methods. So who does the inspections? So I mentioned our 2 inspectors are both licensed veterinary technicians, and that's required now, and as of 2020 in code, that the commissioner, and that's the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, shall employ at least 2 licensed veterinary technicians and shall have the duty to carry out the tasks, etc., to carry out the laws of the Commonwealth. So our 2 inspectors are both LVTs with years of experience. So what are they using to inspect? I'm sure everybody who works in a shelter is familiar with this form. Probably see it in your nightmares, but it's really not that bad. So we're looking for, this is the form that is used during the inspection. If there are citations or violations of a certain code section or regulatory section, That box is checked so that you know which section was the citation was found in, then whether we leave any reference materials. It's signed by our inspector and left on scene after the inspection is complete. And then the inspector will come back to their office and they will complete the inspection summary if there are citations. And this is where the narrative goes into what the citation was, what was found. If there's any pictures that go along with that, they're put into this summary. And then this summary is sent to the executive director or county administrator of the locality for the public animal shelters. So it's sort of the inspection itself is a two-step process for our inspectors. It's the inspection, filling out that inspection form, then returning back to the office and doing the inspection summary, which has more detail and photos of the citation. Then what happens after that? I thought I would spend just a minute talking about the civil penalty process. And so if you've been through this process, you're probably painfully familiar with it, but the code in 3.2, 6546 and 6548, which are the public 6546 and private 6548 sections of code, gives the Board of Agriculture the authority to assess civil penalties. And so we drafted what's called the civil penalty matrix, had to present that to the Board of Agriculture. They approved that. They have to approve any changes. But basically it says that a civil penalty can be assessed for repeat violations or critical violations. And so this is sort of as simple as I could make it, outline of what happens. So there's violations on the inspection that are either repeat non-critical violations or a critical violation, which is one that results in egregious suffering or death of an animal. So either, again, if it's a critical violation or a repeat non-critical violation, that is sent up to Dr. Songer as the veterinary supervisor to review. She sends out what's called the notice of good faith violation, or notice, something like that, notice of good faith, notice of violation and good faith determination. Anyway, something like that, which I can't remember the exact name of it right now, and I feel a little stupid saying that, but I just can't. But she sends that out, and basically it gives the locality or the executive director 30 days to come up with a plan to fix the non-compliances that were found during the inspection. You send that back to us. If the plan is cohesive and makes sense, then we're not going to move forward with civil penalties. If the plan is lacking something or you don't send in a plan, then we're going to move forward with assessing a civil penalty. If we assess a civil penalty, the locality or shelter has the option to basically appeal that civil penalty, and that's called an informal fact-finding conference. That comes to me, and I oversee that informal fact-finding conference, and then I make a determination, either agree with the civil penalty assessment or disagree with it and abate it. If I agree with it and there's still a civil penalty assessment, then that shelter or locality has the option to request another appeal, which is a formal hearing with the hearing officer before the Board of Agriculture. And so this just goes into that a little bit more in detail as to a little chart as to sort of how that whole process works. If you get no findings or a first-time non-critical finding, you just get a copy of that narrative summary. And then on the right, if you have a repeat non-critical or critical, it goes through the process here of the civil penalty and the opportunities for appeal at several spots there. All right, so let's talk about the common shelter findings and sort of how to avoid some of these findings. So I thought it's good to sort of get some perspective. And so we have 165 shelters in fiscal year 2024, which is the last one we have full data for. I don't have data for fiscal year 2025 yet, since that just ended on July 1st. But in fiscal year 2024, we did 107 inspections of shelters. This is just shelter inspections. We had about 50% of those inspections that had no findings, which is great. We had about 25% that had first-time non-critical violations. Again, that could be a record-keeping error. It could be something with sanitation, could be protocol, something like that. But it was a non-critical violation, first time. Again, we don't do anything with that. Then we had about 23% that had repeat non-critical violations that were referred for civil penalty assessment. So about a quarter, not quite a quarter of our shelters are seeing those repeat non-critical violations. And then we had 2 critical violations in fiscal year 2024 that resulted in egregious suffering or animal death in a shelter. So these are the most common violations that we see, and they're the most common repeat violations that we see as well. So we'll kind of go through them individually here. Custody records. I know that's the bane of everybody's existence. It is required by law. So this is not a VDACS requirement. This is a law requirement that you record certain information. And that information is this right here. I'll go back to that previous slide in a second, but this is straight from code. This is what's required for any animal control officer, law enforcement officer, humane investigator, or public or private animal shelter, upon taking custody of any animal, must make a record of that taking custody, and it must include this information. These 7 data points must be kept for at least 5 years and shall be made available for public inspection and to the state veterinarian. So years ago, before I even started, so that was probably about 15, 16 years ago, just in an effort to provide, and this was really before a lot of the computer software systems had really, caught on, that sort of thing. VDACS came up with this sample custody record with the thought that if you fill in, if an animal control officer or a shelter fills in every box on this form, you would be meeting the requirements of this code section. That's why we did it. It was not a requirement of VDACS. It was us trying to make things a little bit easier and give you a sample form to use. That being said, you do not have to use this form. It is not a requirement to use this form. You can use whatever method you want. I always say you could record each data point on a different post-it if you wanted to, but it just has to be recorded that you're capturing this information. I know a lot of shelters have moved towards computer database systems, and that's fine. The only thing I will say is that you have to make sure that you are capturing this information on the date that you take custody. And so the example of that I always use is microchips. So you get an animal, you scan it on that first day, it doesn't have a microchip, you keep it for the stray hold period, it ends up getting adopted. Before it gets adopted, you microchip it because you're a great shelter, and that's what a lot of shelters are doing. I think that's fabulous to microchip animals, but you microchip it on the way out the door or before it's adopted out, and now your computer system says it's microchipped. You need to have some way to show in that computer system that it was not microchipped when you took it into custody. Okay, so that's my only caveat with computer systems, is that you just have to be able to record that in some way And sometimes the computer system, once you put in a microchip number, it shows as the animal was microchipped the whole time it was there. So I'm not familiar with the computer systems. I don't know how to change that, but that's my only caveat there, and one that we've seen some problems on with the computer systems, is that it just changes that initial custody record and information initially on that animal. The same would be true for, the approximate weight of the animal. Presumably, if it comes in skinny, it's going to gain weight while it's in your shelter. We want to capture that custody record at the time custody was taken. Then just a reminder now, the law as of, I think it was 2023, maybe, the duty to scan at least 3 times. And so if you'll look in the middle of this, it says any weaned companion animal at the time of intake, at the time of assessment, and prior to disposition. I think the intent here is that the time of assessment would be, during some sort of cursory examination of the animal. So maybe I think the 3 times would be in the field at intake, at the time of assessment, and prior to disposition, but that's a little murky. So I'm not going to interpret that. I'm just going to say 3 times. You have to examine that animal for a microchip, scan it for a microchip, and then you have to record that you've done that. So you have to maintain documentation from the date of the final disposition of the animal for at least 30 days that you scanned it. It doesn't have to be on the custody record. There's nothing that says it has to be associated with the custody record. Remember, the custody record has to be kept for 5 years. This documentation has to be kept for 30 days. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, but I know a lot of shelters are going towards putting that on their custody record just because it's a convenient place to store that information. But again, that's totally up to you. So that's kind of the most common record keeping issues that we see are incomplete custody records, missing various data points, just leaving them blank or not recording them, which I know is really difficult when you're running around, picking up stray animals, bringing them back in. It gets really busy. I totally get that. We just have to figure out a way that all of those data points are captured. And that's probably the most common thing that we see is data points for the animal custody records not being captured. Probably the second most common repeat non-critical that we see is dry floors. And again, this is one that I totally understand because shelters are wet environments, right? We've got pee, we've got poop, we're cleaning constantly, and we've got to clean with water and soap and disinfectant. And so I totally understand that it is a wet environment that you have to struggle to keep dry, but we have to do it. One, especially when they're young puppies, keeping them dry is very important. You can see the water on the floor of both of these pictures, and wet puppies there in the corner, wet underneath this dog. The reason that we get concerned about it is that chronically wet environments lead to this, which is pododermatitis, which is just a fancy way of saying really inflamed paws that are on the verge of getting infected. And these guys can get infected and it gets really gooey and gross. But you can see the redness there, the swelling between the toe pads, around the nail beds. You can see how wet that paw is. And that's just from being in a chronically wet environment. And so I know it's really difficult to use squeegees and towels and whatever you need to keep it dry. But that's why we harp on that, because we actually do see the signs associated with chronically wet environments in some of these shelter dogs. Of course, I think we would all know this is not an environment we want to keep shelter dogs in. This is actually a shelter in Virginia. So this is a big no-no. And this is these two dogs were being housed outside 24/7 in these enclosures. So this is something that is a definite no on that. You can't, even if this were just for outdoor exercise space, I would not want to use that on a day like that. Oops, sorry. So that's the sanitation again, mostly wet floors. And so that's where most of our violations come there. Then the other big repeat non-critical violation we see is veterinary protocols. These I like to call them the pesky protocols. They have a purpose, but I know that they can be overwhelming at first. And so we have the 3 protocols. We'll go through them each individually here. And the reason why we have the protocols was really, these protocols came about 10 years ago. And what we were seeing before the protocols was a lot of lack of veterinary care in animal shelters. So the thought was, if we require shelters to work with the veterinarian to develop protocols, one, it would increase and strengthen the relationship with the veterinarian, and also provide some guidance to the shelter. So again, these are regulatory requirements. The first protocol is that each shelter shall have a protocol for determining if an ill, injured, or otherwise compromised animal requires treatment. And then the big thing is that you have to adhere to the protocol. So I think we'd agree that all 3 of these animals would require some sort of treatment. And then how do you know? So again, we encourage, although it's not required, to do some sort of health status at intake and then throughout their stay. I'll mention at this point that we do have a guidance document for these protocols. So if you're unsure of where to start, or you want some of these forms that are in here, it's on our website. If you have trouble finding it, just reach out to me and I can send it to you. But we have sample intake evaluation form. That's this one that's up here. That's just a general, like, you could do everything looks normal in the box and you're good to go, or gunky eyes, and put that in the eye section. So it's just a very basic animal intake eval. You may have one that's a little bit more detailed, and that's fine. And again, you're not required to use this. I always make sure to say that you're not required to use this. It's just our way of trying to ease things and give you some examples to start with. And then an animal monitoring log, again, very simplistic animal monitoring law. This is in the guidance document as well. This is an example of the protocol that's in the guidance document. It encompasses, I think, almost everything, this guidance document. It's long, so you don't have to use it as is. It may be too much for your shelter. Your protocol can be like 1 page if you want it. You don't have to use this. So it's up to you, but they're there. And I always feel like it's easier to cut things than it is to try to create things yourself. So share protocols amongst your shelters if you have questions, or use this guidance document. I'll try to find the link before we end and put it in the chat. It is on the website, or like I said, we can email it to you if you send me an email, and you can use that, but you don't have to. It's just a starting point. We even include in the guidance document some very broad examples. Again, these are not all encompassing, but just broad examples of what may be mild, significant, or emergency illnesses. And the point of this protocol would be something like, if you've got an animal that comes in that's lame, if you've got a laceration, when does that need to be seen by the veterinarian versus pale gums? When does that need to be seen by a veterinarian? So it's really, the point of this protocol is so that anybody working in the shelter would know, okay, this animal needs to be seen by a veterinarian. I need to let my supervisor or manager know. remember again that if you have the protocol, whatever protocol you have to adhere to the protocol. And so we see this a lot where the protocol says with a laceration that is full through the skin and muscle showing underneath, the animal needs to be seen by a veterinarian. That's in the protocol, but the animal has been in the shelter for 4 days without seeing a veterinarian. You're not adhering to your own protocol. So that's just an example of that. Remember, whatever is in the protocol, you need to adhere to the protocol. Second protocol is that every shelter should have a protocol for the control of infectious and contagious disease. That's one. Then the other part of that is shall have a marked isolation room for the containment of those contagious and infectious disease. So every single one of these animals certainly would be apt to go into the isolation room. And that should be when to put them in the isolation room should be part of that protocol. Again, we have a sample protocol that you can start with. You don't have to use it completely. You don't have to use it at all, but it just has some basic information in there. Again, this is where things should be, where we see some sanitation issues as part of these infectious disease protocols, because the whole point of this protocol is to have a sanitary environment where we're not spreading disease around. You know, of course, I always compare shelters to like daycare, right? You're bringing in animals from unknown, unvaccinated, who knows the history of, you're bringing them together. It is the prime environment to share all sorts of fun diseases. So we want to minimize that as much as possible. And to do that, we need to have a clean environment, have materials that we can clean and disinfect, and free of any cracks, crevices that can trap that feces, manure type of what's the word I'm looking for? Substance. Sure, we'll go with that one. Isolation room. This is another big one that we see. Not necessarily. I think that I think everyone has an isolation room. The issue is oftentimes they're being used for things that aren't isolation. And I get that. You've got busy, full shelters, and it seems silly to have a room that stays empty except for on the odd occasion that you're going to need to put a sick animal in there. But the point is, again, to minimize spreading disease in your shelter. And so you need to have that isolation room set up for when you get the puppy in that's having bloody diarrhea, so you don't have parvo spread everywhere, or the puppy that has bad skin that has scabies before that spreads everywhere, or ringworm, or the kitten with upper respiratory before you get a upper respiratory outbreak. So it should be maintained and in a ready state, should be marked as isolation, not to be used for other purposes, not for your bite quarantines or something like that, just for diseased animals. Here's just some example of marking it. The third protocol is for the management of neonatal and medically compromised animals. We were seeing a lot of, especially neonatal animals, that like puppies, like 2-week-old, 1-pound puppies that were being housed in a run. And we actually have pictures of animals that got through the bottom of the run cage and suffocated, of puppies that got squashed because they were in an inappropriate cage or run environment. We saw a lot of neonatal kitten death because people would take in these neonatal unweaned kittens, leave them in the shelter overnight, come back in the morning, and half of them would die. Well, if you're going to take in neonatal animals, you have to be prepared to have them nurse every 2 hours. If you don't have a dam that's nursing, then you're going to have to feed them every 2 hours and make them defecate and urinate. And if that's not something that the shelter can do, then you shouldn't be taking them in. So this was an effort to try to say, if you're going to take in these animals, what's your plan to do with them? Again, we have a sample protocol for that as well. And just make sure that they're housed appropriately. If you've got neonates, most likely they're going to need some sort of heat source to help. Or if you've got an animal with a broken leg, it's most likely going to need cage rest and not a huge run where it can run around. All right, a quick little blurb for animal control officers. Literally, this is our website. Trying to see if I see the, I'll find the link for, because I see that in the chat. I'll find the link for the guidance document. But if you're an animal control officer, we have a whole section on our website that is just for animal control officers that includes a lot of information that you might need, including your training request form. Just a reminder, all animal control officers, we talked about this at the beginning, need that 15 hours every 3 years. And we'll just skip past that. Okay. So now we're going to move in for the next like 30 to 40 minutes, talk about avian influenza. Those were our most common shelter findings. And again, as long as you're following those, keeping those in mind, you should be pretty good for a shelter. So avian influenza, the reason that we're talking about it is the current outbreak that's going on. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of avian influenza. The scary thing to me is that second little point there, 35 plus days in manure, soil, and water. The virus can survive 3 months in cold weather. So that's why it's a pretty hardy virus from a weather standpoint and in moist environments. It's normally carried by wild waterfowl, but it can affect a wide variety of species, not just avian. We'll talk about that in a minute. You'll hear the H and the N, and those are just surface antigens on the surface of the virus. And there's, I think, here we go, 16 of these H proteins and 9 of the N proteins, and they recombine. And so when you hear H5N1, which is what we're going to talk about now, it's just that has the 5th H protein and the 1st N protein that we found so far. You can have H5N7, you can have H1N8. There's a wide variety of combinations, up to 144 combinations. The main ones we're concerned about for avian influenza are H5 and H7. And you might also hear highly pathogenic avian influenza and low pathogenic avian influenza. Low pathogenic avian influenza is one that occurs naturally. It's in domestic wild waterfowl. Generally minor symptoms or no symptoms in birds. Not as big of a deal for us. It's very common in the US and around the world. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, though, is what we're really concerned about, because while it's found in wild waterfowl normally, it can cause die-offs in wild waterfowl. In Delaware and Maryland this past winter, they had literally thousands of snow geese that dropped out of the sky on Delaware beaches. And so it can cause mass die-offs in wild birds, and then it can get into our chickens and turkeys and cause mass die-offs in them as well. It is a reportable disease, which just means it needs to be reported to the state veterinarian's office, and we take action on it, both low path and high path. Doesn't mean a whole lot for you guys. It means a whole lot more for our veterinarians. So if you work with any veterinarians, then they will probably be familiar with it and know that it's reportable. How is it spread? Again, it's found in wild waterfowl, our Canadian geese friends, our ducks and geese, migratory birds that are traveling up and down the coastline, and they poop and pee without really much care about where that's going, and it just drops out of the sky onto us. Here's some of our migration patterns. We're in the blue, obviously, but you'll kind of see what happens is that as birds travel north and south for migration for breeding and feeding, those flyways start to overlap. And even the map on the right, you'll see that they overlap with birds from other countries. And so all of these birds are meeting up in the northern hemisphere to breed. They share their diseases. Influenza likes to mutate and recombine. And so they'll share new strains of influenza, and then they migrate down, pooping and peeing as they're migrating down, and it gets into our domestic species. So why do we care? I care because I'm an infectious disease specialist, so I think that's pretty cool. But we also care because it can infect chickens and turkeys. It has serious economic impacts on the poultry industry. The other reason that we care is that it's zoonotic, or it can be zoonotic, and we'll talk about that as well. We're also particularly concerned now that we're seeing highly pathogenic avian influenza, or that HPAI, in other species besides birds, and that's become a little bit concerning. So why do we care so much here in Virginia about poultry? And that's because it is the single biggest economic influencer, economic impact in Virginia. Upwards of $5 billion of impact, and we are number one. We're number, let's see, I think it's number 6th for turkeys, and number 10th for meat chickens in the United States. These are just some examples of the news articles that have come out. This, thankfully, right now, we're in a little bit of a lull for HPAI. It's the summer, and just like flu for humans, this tends to be a fall and winter disease. So the fact that that map is all tan, what will happen, and this map is updated weekly on the USDA website, is that if we see a new detection of HPAI, the state will turn red. And so the fact that we're not seeing any red is a good sign. But since 2022, you can see the grand total there. We've had over 1,700 farms detected with HPAI throughout the United States. That's a huge number. And so this includes both commercial poultry and backyard poultry and zoological species, etc. So the interesting thing that happened in 2024 is that all of a sudden we had highly pathogenic avian influenza that we've been seeing in poultry and in wild waterfowl, and all of a sudden we started seeing it in dairy cattle. And what happened was, in Texas, there were some dairy cattle that became ill. They couldn't figure out what was going on with them. A veterinarian went to one of his dairy clients to see some of these sick cows, and noticed that when he came this time, he didn't have the normal dairy cats that surrounded the farm rubbing against his leg to say hi. And he said, "What happened? Where are the cats?" And the dairy farmer said, "Funny thing about the cats, like 3 of them died, and we don't know why." And he said, "Well, let me look at them too." And they actually found the avian influenza virus in the cats and then the milk of the dairy cattle, because of this veterinarian noticing that the cats weren't there like they normally were. So what we think happened was that, based on doing a lot of genetics testing and other sort of really advanced genetic modeling, is that probably what happened was the dairy cow was out on pasture, somehow ingested some feces from an infected wild waterfowl that got in to the animal. For whatever reason, this particular virus likes milk, and so the virus itself settled in the mammary glands, caused inflammation and infection in the mammary glands, which then the virus came out in the raw milk. The cats, because a lot of dairies have cats on the farm, they kind of go hand in hand. The cats were drinking the raw milk, got avian influenza. Unfortunately, in cats, avian influenza leads to neurologic signs similar to rabies and death. In cattle, it was just causing mastitis or mammary gland issues. So this has been sort of the first time this has been detected in the entire world was here in the US. And so you may hear about AI in cattle and in cats and other species. This map shows the tan states are the states that have had detections of AI in dairy cattle. This map shows the detections. This is back to, I think this is from, 2025, March of 2025. HPAI detections in wild birds throughout the United States. So you can see it's everywhere. I'll go through just a little sample here of what you might see, but I don't have in here a slide on more information on the cats, but the other thing that we're seeing is HPAI in zoological specimens. So there was a couple of zoos that had large cats. Those large cats became ill and died because they were given turkeys that had been infected with avian influenza, raw turkeys that had been infected with avian influenza. And unfortunately, in these predator species like cats, like foxes in the wild, that eat infected animals, it tends to cause these neurologic signs and sudden death, and there's no treatment for it. Where in some of the other species, they get sick, like cattle, they get sick, mostly mammary signs, and then they get better. So this is just a one sort of case that we had here in Virginia. This was actually our first case back in 2023, I think. No, 2022. I'm sorry, 2022. Where a woman that had, or a couple that had some backyard birds. They had chickens and turkeys in their backyard, and they lost, on Friday, they called us, they lost 1 turkey Tuesday, 7 turkeys by Friday, and by Friday evening, they'd lost 50% or 20 chickens and 7 turkeys. And so we confirmed that it was avian influenza on Saturday. Unfortunately, with avian influenza, it being a virus, there's no antibiotics or treatment to avian influenza. As with most viruses, it's just sort of supportive care. But for whatever reason, this particular strain of avian influenza is just really, really devastating. And once these birds get sick, there's nothing we can do to help them. And so unfortunately, the treatment of choice is to depopulate or humanely euthanize them to stop the suffering, so it doesn't take a while. And you'll see some pictures and you'll understand why. But if you'll notice, this is the woman's backyard, and on the side, that the picture that's closest to you, those 3 ducks and those swans that are closest to you are hers, but you'll see a bunch of black dots on the opposite side of the pond. That's all Canadian geese. There are hundreds of Canadian geese on the other side sharing the pond with her ducks and geese, and then her ducks and geese are sharing the lawn and the space with her chickens and turkeys. And so unfortunately, these were the chickens and turkeys. These are still alive. These are not deceased animals. That's how sick they were. They were just laying there. They had copious amounts of just snot, for lack of a better word, coming out. I mean, just really depressed, slowly dying. These were all the chickens, just swollen, not eating, lots of discharge. So unfortunately, it was the best we could do for them was to humanely euthanize them. So what are the clinical signs if either you have backyard birds or you're dealing with backyard chickens or turkeys, or you get some into your shelter? Because certainly we're seeing that more these days. We're seeing a lot of people with backyard birds, so occasionally they'll come into the shelter. Decreased activity, not wanting to eat or drink water, decreased egg production or eggs that are misshapen. Unfortunately, with avian influenza, a lot of what you'll see is just sudden death. And that's regardless of species. Swollen heads, sort of a purple discoloration, lots of discharge, lots of diarrhea. So we do a lot to prepare for commercial and backyard avian influenza here in Virginia. We meet quarterly to discuss avian influenza response, and we have plans to prepare for. We've got several labs in our lab system that are prepared to do lots of testing for avian influenza. We do a lot of what we call pre-movement testing. So this is testing that all birds, if you're in commercial channels, will have to undergo avian influenza testing within a certain time period before they leave the farm. And so we're constantly testing. We do a lot of outreach to county fairs and poultry auctions or shows and do testing there. So we do a lot of outreach around avian influenza. How do we respond? It's very detailed response plan, but it involves quarantining, again, humanely euthanizing, monitoring birds that are in a surrounding area, because we know that if we're seeing avian influenza in one farm, that most likely the domestic waterfowl that passed overhead of the farm next door as well. So we do a lot of monitoring and surveillance. We do a lot of disinfecting. So thankfully the virus is killed pretty easily with certain disinfectants. So we do a lot of cleaning and disinfection and then testing to make sure that the farm is free of virus. Won't go into that, but I do want to sort of stop here and talk about why we're talking about it today, which is not only, again, I'm an infectious disease geek, and so I like talking about weird, scary diseases, but more importantly for you guys is I think you need to be informed of avian influenza and the potential that it might cause disease in those handling infected poultry or livestock. So we've seen 70 people so far in the United States since 2022 that have been diagnosed with highly pathogenic avian influenza. All of these have been diagnosed after handling infected poultry or livestock. There was one case in Canada where a young man was diagnosed with it and had no history of interacting with any diseased or infected animals. So we're not sure how he came down with it, but the vast majority has been from handling infected poultry, or like I said, those cattle, the dairy cattle. If you think about it, 70 people sounds like a lot, but if you think about the thousands of people that interact with poultry and livestock every day across our farms in the US, it's really not very many. So we don't think that this virus transmits very easily to humans. But again, we have seen it in cats, domestic short hair cats. We've seen it in our large cats at zoos. We had unfortunately 3 zoological cases here in Virginia at 3 different zoos or petting zoos here in Virginia. Some of those were pretty rare bird species, cranes, pretty rare cranes that became infected. So we're seeing it in a wide variety of animals. You may see it either if you're dealing with poultry as an ACO, if you go out to a farm and you're dealing with poultry, if you have poultry coming into your shelter, or if you have cats coming into your shelter, and they're going to be cats that look like rabies. They're going to be neurologic, most likely. And so with those cats, we actually work with the health department to rule out rabies first before we do testing for avian influenza. If you go to CDC, because their CDC is in charge of public health and prevention for people from zoonotic diseases. I like CDC a lot, but I don't like their website for these recommendations because it's too much. There's a lot of narrative on there. What I like is, because I'm pretty simple, is just show me what I need to know, right? Show me what I need to wear, show me how to prevent. And so if you're gonna be dealing with poultry, sick poultry, you don't need to do this every time you get a chicken that's lost in the city and comes into your shelter. But if it's got discharge, put on gloves, preferably a mask as well, but definitely gloves. If you are, and eyewear, because some of those people that have gotten sick have had conjunctivitis. If you're an ACO and you go out on a call, which I've gotten several of, you go out on a dog welfare call, and oh, by the way, there's 100 chickens running around outside and there's a whole bunch of dead ones. Give me a call and we'll talk through it and figure out if we need to test some of those birds. If you go out on a call and there's a couple of dead cats and dead poultry, definitely give me a call, because we'll need to figure out what to do from there. If you have any reservations at all with anything, I think it's common sense. If anything's dripping snot, blood, urine, feces, put on gloves, right? You don't want that on yourself. So, but with avian influenza, it's also good to put on a mask and like glasses just to prevent that splashback into your eye. So that's why we wanted to talk about avian influenza today, not just because I find it scarily interesting, but because you may come across it as an ACO or a shelter worker. So I ran through that kind of fast. I see some comments in the chat. So let me go back and look at those, and then we can have any other questions. So if a private shelter rescue has received an animal with a chip as a transfer from a public animal shelter, can we fairly assume that the burden of responsibility to trace that chip belongs to the original shelter and not the receiving rescue? Oh, that's a loaded question right there, Ryan. I think if you have an animal, that it might be worth that conversation with the public shelter of, did you trace back this chip? I wouldn't assume that they traced it back without having that conversation that they traced it back. Certainly all of my animals are microchipped, and if they get out, I would want whoever picks them up to try to contact me to let me know that they're found. So I think that's worthy of a conversation between the shelters to say, who is traced back, and do you have documentation that you've traced that back? The documentations I will find in a second, the guidance document link, or like I said, you can email me and I can send it directly to you. And then if we microchip an animal while in our care, does it need to be added to the original custody record? If your software indicates the data chip is inserted, you don't have to record it to the original custody record. In fact, the original custody record should show that the animal was not microchipped. let's see, the old custody record form from 1013 required owner's signature for surrender. The new form. The new form. Chris, send me your email. Let me look into that about the surrender signature, because that's a code requirement. So I need to look into those two forms and see. But I'll get back to you. And then let me get out of this stop share. Get out of that, and let me see if I can find the guidance document link real quick. Does anybody have any other questions while I try to double team here? Somebody must have something.
To the question in the chat about will we be able to access this recording later? Yes, this is being recorded and it will be shared.
I actually don't see it on the website, so let me put my email in there. And if you email me that you want the guidance document for the protocols, I will send that to you. We're probably going to be trying to update those a little bit, and that may have been why we took them off. I vaguely remember doing that now to update them. But yes, I can definitely send them to you. So you can email me that you want the guidance document for the protocols, and I will get it to you. Does anybody have any other questions on animal shelter stuff or avian influenza or anything else that you might want to know about?
Okay, it looks like everyone can access your email in the chat and if they have any follow-ups. But thank you so much, Dr. Bissett. This was fantastic. We appreciate your time.
No problem. No problem at all. Everybody just reach out.